Salutations everyone! World of Warcraft to me has always been filled with some really captivating and interesting stories that I think I'll always adore, or at the very least enjoy talking about. I mean, I think it would definitely be quite weird if I didn't enjoy doing this whole thing at this point. But today we're going to do something different. Rather than talking about the current lore, we are instead going to change it entirely and say what we think will happen. And in a very Skull Shorties fashion, as I'm sure you've seen the title and the thumbnail, we are of course going to talk about Rexxar. And what would happen if he was named Warchief instead of Garrosh Hellscream. For my own ease, this will be covering the events of only Cataclysm. I have no idea at this time of how many parts there will actually be, but let's go ahead and get this started. So let's begin during the time of when the new Warchief was appointed by Thrall. The elements were in turmoil. The new world and region that the Horde had inhabited was in chaos. Thrall had to learn what was going on by visiting his people planet of Draenor, or now known as Outlands. With this, someone would have to take his place as Warchief of the Horde in his absence. Thrall had considered naming Draenor Sarfang, but he had been slain by the Lich King. His father, Sarfang, was another Thrall had considered naming the leader of the Horde, but he was far too old and broken over his son's recent death. Right now, Garrosh Hellscream, the hero of Northrend and son of the late Garrosh Hellscream, was the most likely choice in his mind. He brought this to the attention of his old friend Cairne Bloodhoof, who had witnessed Garrosh's brashness firsthand upon his arrival here from his trip to Northrend against the Cavaldir and the Alliance. Cairne disagreed heavily with Thrall's reasoning and implored him to reconsider. Instead of being stubborn and firm with his decision, Thrall would then ask Cairne the following.
Who would you have me name as Warchief then? Those I would name are dead, saddened, or far too old. My options are few and far between.
Cairne collected himself and then reflected, and then he would utter the name of Rexxar, the man who single-handedly defended the Horde's future against the madman Dalen Proudmoore, whose obsession to rid the Orcs and the Horde from the world was nearly successful, had it not been for Rexxar. Rexxar had saved the Tauren, Darkspears, Ogres, and Orcs multiple times on the continent of Kalimdor, and had proven to be a level-headed and strong leader. Not only that, but Rexxar had also saved Cairne's son, Bane, from being eaten by the Centaur. Thrall hadn't even considered the Mok'Nathal, whom he had named the Horde's champion, several years back. While it was true he was a very capable leader, he believed Rexxar's lone wolf attitude would prevent him from being too involved with the Horde, especially as a vocal leader. He had respected Rexxar's wishes to be left alone and only needed when absolutely necessary. But this would only be temporary as far as Thrall was concerned. Plus, given the state of the world and the tensions with the Alliance, having a hero like Rexxar in the place of Warchief would not be a bad idea. Thrall would agree with Cairne's wisdom finally and call upon the Mok'Nathal, who was in the city very recently, as he had defended it from the rampaging fire elementals within the Valley of Honor. Rexxar would be reluctant to such a position and even outright opposed it at first. But as explained to him by both Cairne and Thrall, he would only hold the title until Thrall would return, and that plenty of the other leaders within the Horde would help him should he require it. Being almost peer-pressured in by his friends, Rexxar would take up the mantle of the Warchief of the Horde.
Rexxar, I name you Warchief of the Horde. Lead us well until my return. For the Horde! For the Horde!
His first act as leader of the whole Horde would be to have Orgrimmar repaired and remade by its chief architect, Gazlowe. Rexxar would make several quests that he could think of, as asked by the Goblin. And unlike the environmental nightmare that Garrosh had come up with, where the waters were polluted and the skies above would be covered in industrial smoke, it would be far more akin to the Orgrimmar of old, with a few improvements here and there to the buildings and walls, as to ensure that the enraging elementals or any other threats couldn't easily break Orgrimmar. So, picture an Orgrimmar that's a combination of the two that we're aware of. With Rexxar installed as the new Warchief of the Horde, he would find approval from most of the other racial leaders, as they already felt indebted to him during the founding of Durotar. The two most uncertain of Rexxar, as they had fewer interactions with him, were both the Lady Sylvanas and Northamar Theron. But the champion of the Horde also did little to dampen their trust in him either. As for the Alliance, they were indifferent to the half-ogre being installed as Warchief. From reports, he was similar to that of Thrall in more ways than one, and had a sense of honor. Varian was the most reluctant out of all of them, as his friend Dalen was snuffed out by this half-breed. Regardless if Jaina was confident in him or not, his hands were drenched in human blood. As at that time, the scars from the Wrathgate were still very fresh, and he had nearly been killed by Garona Halforkin, another half-breed, who was responsible for the death of his father, King Lane. A peace treaty was also recently written after the fall of the Lich King between the Alliance and Horde that would keep them from each other's lands and waters for a time. And with that treaty written, Varian wouldn't do anything unless provoked, and likewise the same would be for the newly appointed Warchief Rexxar. Around this time, the Twilight's Hammer and their Dark Masters, the Old Gods, would enact their sinister plots to drive a wedge between the Alliance and Horde. Now, with the information of Rexxar as Warchief, they knew that the Horde would not turn on him, but instead, they would focus on that lingering hatred between the Alliance and Horde. Druids who were meeting peacefully would be struck down by this band of cultists, leading to the sole survival of a Mool rune totem to tell the tale. Rather than posing as orcs lusting for war under Garrosh, they would instead pose as soldiers from the Alliance, wanting vengeance for the fallen at the Wrathgate, and for Dalen's killer to be maimed for what he did. The Night Elves in the area would be taken out in the crossfire. Cairne would deliver these reports to Rexxar in person after having Hamul be treated. Greatly upset by this clear breaking of their treaty, Rexxar would want the Alliance to answer for this consequence immediately. The Alliance would be taken aback by this, as some of their own would openly engage and break the treaty that they signed. What if the Horde was lying? They had no idea who could have been responsible, and offered to look into it. And Rexxar would oblige, but his patience was wearing thin already. The young, headstrong Garrosh was not twiddling his thumbs and doing nothing at this time either. He was not certain that this half-breed could do a proper job as Warchief, and was especially not convinced when Rexxar did not declare war for their most recent act. Before Thrall left, he had gifted to him his father's axe, Gorhel, as to congratulate him for his achievements in Northrend. But he sensed that Thrall had another purpose in mind for him, but to what he'll never know, as Thrall was gone and away. Garrosh would march into the great halls of Goromash Hold and demand that Rexxar do something beyond just wait for the Alliance to. Their interactions at this point were few and far between, but Rexxar sensed that he did not like Garrosh that much, just as he did not enjoy his father's company either back in the day. The feeling was mutual on Garrosh's side too. They argued over what to do and for how for hours, until finally Garrosh would erupt and challenge Rexxar to the rulership of the whole Horde through the Mak'gara of old. To the death. Just as it was in the main timeline, they would draw in quite the crowd in Orgrimmar, but Magatha would not be there to support Garrosh. Instead, it would be his friend from Northrend, Saranac the Mystic, while Rexxar would have the aid of Bovan Windtotem, who had assisted Rexxar in saving Bane years ago. No trickery or cheating was committed. Both fighters would wear no armor and only their weapons in hand, with Garrosh with Gorhal and Rexxar with both of his axes. The two powerful warriors would clash, and over the course of their match, Rexxar seemed the most favorable of the two. While it was true that Rexxar relied on his beasts from time to time, he was also a powerful warrior who had both brain and brawn in his arsenal. And while it was true that Garrosh was also a skilled warrior, he had struggled in the main timeline against Cairne, and had no poison this time to end this match quickly. Rexxar would disarm the legendary axe from Garrosh's hands and knock the brash orc out. Rexxar would not kill Garrosh, though in some instances he very much liked to, and saw Garrosh as someone who'd oppose him and was clearly a problem. He would not end him like this. Should Garrosh prove to continue to be a reliability, then Garrosh would answer to his axes. Some within the Horde saw this as dishonoring Garrosh, while others saw this as a goodwill to a hero like Garrosh Hellscream. Regardless, Rexxar would rather have Garrosh as someone to work within the Horde. If he could change him, he could perhaps benefit the Horde someday. But right now, he needed this brash orc to work with him, as he saw war was definitely on the horizon. With the Makara dealt with, and Garrosh recovering from his wounds, he would begrudgingly agree to Rexxar's authority and strength, though he felt humiliated and disgruntled by not being killed as they had agreed on. At this time of confusion and focus being spent in Orgrimmar, and the two venerated leaders being there, Magatha would make her move while Cairne was away in Orgrimmar. She would have Thunderbluff and the several other Tauren regions taken by force, and with the aid of her Grim Totem. Bane Bloodhoof would be among the casualties in this assault, as the guilt-ridden Javon never warned or saved him. Cairne would learn of Magatha's antics and the loss of his son, and be enraged by her treachery. Rexxar too was filled with both grief and anger. He recalled how kind and optimistic the young Tauren was when he saved him, and now he was taken away by the crone of the Grim Totem forever. Rexxar felt partially to blame for Cairne's attention being taken away to help instruct Rexxar, and to watch what was a useless fight between the two angry orcs. He would personally offer his aid and the Hordes to take back Thunderbluff, and the several other regions. Surprisingly, Garrosh would offer his aid too to the Old Bull, as he had respect for Cairne and a great disrespect for Magatha and her cowardly tactics. Magatha attempted to use hostages to ensure her victory over the bluffs, but she severely underestimated the full bulk of the Horde, as one by one her soldiers and outposts were claimed and reclaimed by the Horde. The wrath of the three powerhouses like Garrosh, Rexxar, and Cairne were seen on the battlefield firsthand, and Magatha had very little time to react accordingly. She tried to escape her fate, but was met with Cairne firsthand. He would not allow her to leave, and he would not spare her for what she did to his boy. Magatha would meet a quick but painful end to his rune spear. But the victory over reclaiming Thunderbluff would be a hollow one, as Cairne would be overcome by grief and loss over his son's demise. Rexxar fully knew this Cairne well, and there was no way of pulling him out of it this time, and would be forced to leave his old friend to grieve for the loss of his only child. Garrosh and Rexxar would establish a bond from this hard-fought battle, and respect for one another, though it was short and overshadowed by Cairne's grief. Thrall would return briefly, overhearing the news of the peace treaty already being broken, the Makara between Garrosh and Rexxar, and the death of Bane Bloodhoof. Several of the Horde's leaders would attend Bane's funeral and honor him even if he did not die a warrior's death. He surely lived a life of honor and deserved to have a longer one.
Do you regret choosing me as Warchief?
Rexxar uttered to Thrall. Thrall could tell immediately that Rexxar blamed himself for the loss of Bane. That was written on what he could tell on his friend's face, despite it being covered by the wolf cowl.
No, I do not, my old friend. You did what you thought was right, and you avenged him. Do not blame yourself for the antics of a coward. You and Garrosh could not foresee your duel as the opportunity for which to strike.
Thrall replied, and Rexxar nodded dutifully. There's a cold air between them. While it was short, Thrall could tell he was no longer the same person, and that the mantle of Warchief was already weighing down on Rexxar, just as it had for him. And it too would change Rexxar if it was worn longer, and Rexxar knew that he would have to, given Thrall's current new mission to go to the Maelstrom. Thrall, Rexxar, Vol'jin, Garrosh, and others who attended gave Bane their last respects and goodbyes to one another before departing. Cairne, ever wounded and struck by sorrow, would speak to Rexxar alone.
You've witnessed me like this once before, and you stoke the fires in me by saving him. You not only saved my boy, but you saved me. You saved my people from my own sorrow, drowning them.
Rexxar shook his head.
No, you didn't. And I cannot lead my people, Warchief. Not now, at least. I will not let them drown, but I cannot be the one to bring them out of it, either.
It was painful to hear Cairne like this once more, but Rexxar knew it was coming, and he knew fully well he had to take some responsibility.
Then I will be the one until you have the strength again, or until a new leader is appointed. This is my burden to bear. I will help you, my brother.
Cairne managed a soft but weak smile.
Thank you, Rexxar. Now, please leave me to my son.
He knew he was being selfish by doing this, but Rexxar could not blame him for it. He would leave before paying one final respect to Bane alongside Cairne. The Tauren were now part of Rexxar's responsibility too, at least until Hamul recovered or a newly appointed Tauren chieftain was made. With this, he shirked some of his responsibilities as Warchief to both Vol'jin and Eitrig, who were not as opposed to helping Rexxar during these dire times. Conflicts between the Alliance and Horde began to rise with the return of the Black Dragon aspect, Deathwing, whose re-emergence caused a great destruction in his wake. The Twilight's Hammer successfully managed to convince the Alliance that the Horde was up to no good, and vice versa between the Horde and the Alliance. And so conflict would erupt between the two sides, no matter what Rexxar did or say. And so, he would have to embrace the call of war once again, even if he wasn't thrilled about it. This would include the newly opened region of Gilneas, which Sylvanas had her eyes glued all over, and while Rexxar had belayed her every order of retaking the lands of Lordaeron through her unorthodox means, he could not deny that the threat the Worgen showed, especially as the Gilneans had a deep connection with the Koltyrans, and the resentment for Rexxar in his role to play against Daelin. so Rexxar would be forced to approve their war and the defense against Gilneas, as already the Gilneans and these Worgens were breaching into Tirisful glades. Through this, she also showed him the Valkyr, which while Rexxar had little to no involvement in Northrend, he was not a fan of the high-level use of necromancy or the plague. Rexxar would show both disdain and resentment for it, and would have his old friend Nazgul watch over her and ensure she would not go overboard in her campaign. Much like in our reality, the Forsaken would not dominate Gilneas completely, and would be forced to go behind their Warchief's back and deploy the plague. Ultimately, the Horde and Alliance would be at a small standstill, but Nazgul would report every detail that Sylvanas ordered back to his Warchief, leaving him both flabbergasted and upset with the Banshee Queen, something that he would have to deal with later. Meanwhile, back on Kalimdor, the Goblins of Kazan will be sent by Thrall to join the Horde and meet with Rexxar personally. Rexxar showed very little love for the level of industry that the Goblins had, and warned them not to go overboard with it as they moved into Ajara, as he had just made a deal with the Night Elves for some of that land to go to the Horde. As of right now, the Night Elves were actually on good terms with the Horde, as Rexxar did very little to agitate them, though they were still part of the Alliance, which would lead to minor conflicts as compared to the Eastern Kingdoms. Though in the Barrens, both southern and now northern, as they were now split apart by the shattering that Deathwing committed, the vast majority of the Alliance forces were ex-Kultiran from Theramore, and they too would start to show their agitation and hatred towards the Horde, further encouraged by the espionage of the Twilight's Hammer. Rexxar would increasingly have to send Horde troops to aid in the defense of the northern parts of the Barrens, as well as the union formed between the Grim Totem and the Alliance, as Cairne's action of slaughtering Magatha would have its own consequences. In Fairloss, where many of the Tauren from Thousand Needles were being relocated, ogres in the Stonemaul clan and the Gorduni clan were both being converted into the Twilight's Hammer. Rexxar would take this rather personally, and would have Cho'Gall expelled from the region, and would make it a part of his personal quest as leader of the Horde to ensure Cho'Gall was disposed of immediately. For this, Rexxar would lead an excursion to the Twilight Highlands, alongside Overlord Garrosh Hellscream. Garrosh would be sent on an envoy to meet up and negotiate with the Dragonmaw clan to become allies, while Rexxar would lead an army to deal with Cho'Gall and his forces, once and for all. During their flight, Deathwing would show up to disrupt and destroy their zeppelins, splitting the two up. Garrosh would dispose of Morgor, the current chieftain of the Dragonmaw, with the aid of the Horde champion and Zayla, installing Zayla as the new leader of the Dragonmaw, while Rexxar would meet up with Garona Half-Organ, who'd both exchange a bond over their hatred for ogres and their relation as both being half-bloods. While Rexxar, Garona, Zayla, and Garrosh would conduct a plan on how to get rid of Cho'Gall, it became acutely aware that someone knew their assault in the Twilight Highlands, and warned Deathwing. Vol'jin, as the acting Warchief at this time, during Rexxar's departure, would discover that Saranac, Garrosh's old friend, turned out to be the culprit and the main leader of the Twilight's Hammer within Orgrimmar, and would be disposed of immediately. Together united along with the Earthen Ring and the Red Dragonflight, the Horde might prevail against Cho'Gall, to which Rexxar would be forced to convince the Dragonmaw to change their ways on how to conduct themselves around dragons, in order for such an alliance to be possible. Whether the change would remain was heavily dependent on how Rexxar kept his eye on the mischievous clan. He hopes that his teachings would be enough for now. The Twilight's Hammer would fall thanks to the aid of this union along with a champion of the Alliance and the Horde, but also through Garona, who would at last get her vengeance on the two-headed ogre. And at long last, the Bastion of Twilight, along with all its masters and cronies, would be dealt with. Garona, usually a loner, now felt safe and confident with Rexxar as the Horde's main leader, and the two developed an unlikely friendship over their initial malice-ritual goal. Garona would ultimately stay within the Horde, and because of this, would become the new leader of the group, not the clan, of the Shattered Hand, the Orcs, or rather the Horde's assassins and intel group, acting as the Horde's main spymaster and advising the Warchief and informing him on the secrets throughout the world. All around the globe, the Twilight's Hammer and agents of the Old Gods began to reel from defeat after defeat. Even Ragnaros the Fire Lord and his agents of flame would not be enough to stop the might of Azeroth. Thrall, now emboldened by the 5 dragon aspects and the dragon soul, would send Deathwing to the crushing depths of the Maelstrom, and then obliterate him to dust. The Cataclysm was over, but conflict would not fully cease, and the reign of Rexxar was not fully done as well, despite what was promised to him. A new world was on the horizon that would forever change the landscape of Azeroth. While the Horde and Alliance were not as bitter and heated as they might have been had Garrosh been chosen, new hatreds were born from Rexxar's choices and decisions. And ultimately, that's where I'm going to leave it on, as I think I've been talking on long enough. For part 2, we'll be covering the events of Pandaria, and how events will play differently. I hope you all enjoyed this what-if scenario if Rexxar was named as Warchief instead. If you have any suggestions on what to do next, or what to add, please feel free to do so in the comments below. I want to thank my amazing voice cast for providing their voices for this script. You can find them down in the description down below too. And if you're interested in any of the stuff that I do, you can find me over on Twitter, Twitch, and all that jazz in the description. Also, if you like these videos, you can support me on Patreon like these amazing folks here. But until next time, my friends, see ya!